Hello there. Hope you are doing fine. If you don't know what an API is, you are at the right place. After watching this video, you will understand and learn the API concept. I will try to use simple everyday examples that you can relate to and recall this concept anytime. You don't have to watch the video again and again after understanding this concept. Apart from understanding what API is, you would also understand why we need to use API, what are other real-time examples of an API, and how API is an umbrella term. This video, unlike other videos, don't focuses on the REST API right away. It just stick to the basic focus on API. API, you may know the acronym of an API. API stands for Application Programming Interface. So we will go by each term. I'll try to explain all this term not necessarily in the same order. So let's start with an application. So what is application means to you? What kind of picture comes to your mind when you use this word application? Basically, application is nothing but any program running on a computer. Program which is nothing but a set of instruction given to computer in a language that computer understand to perform some task. I am recording this particular video using some application. You are probably watching this in your mobile YouTube app, which is also an application, or maybe in a browser, which is also an application. Application is something that running on the computer. You can divide application in various forms depending upon the classification criteria. A simple classification criteria, you can use a desktop based app like a browser, Microsoft Paint or Excel, or browser-based app, YouTube, Twitter, or your Citibank account which you use to do money transfer. Browser-based application, though you render application in your browser, they also runs on some another machine called a server. So that is the difference between browser-based or web-based application and desktop-based application. Desktop-based application runs on your machine and you can close at any point of a time, unlike a browser-based application which you can use but they are still running on some another machine called as a server. Applications can also be divided in other categories by the way how they get used, like if they are increase the efficiency, if they helps in communication, or they use as a platform for information distribution, or just for fun. Let's take few an example. Right, so WhatsApp, we can add this in communication section or even information section where it has helping us to communicate with friends or distributing some useful information in a group. Recently, WhatsApp also starting as a payment gateway where we can share money. Let's take an example of on Facebook. Facebook is a communication platform and maybe fun because it has an games in it which we can play while we are on Facebook. Also, Facebook generally get used by the as an information distribution platform as well. Another example, e-sports, the games you like, maybe just can categorize as a fun. Let's take an example of a Citibank, right? Citibank app. You would add it in efficiency category. If there is a no banking app, you may have to write a check, go to the bank, deposit that, and then the bank clerk has to reduce money from your account and credit into the someone one's account. But instead of that, what you do, you use a bank app on your mobile and you just transfer money sitting at home. You increase the efficiency of everyone by the automation using that app. So we can divide this application in different form the way we want. We earlier we saw whether they are desktop or web based, and now we have saw the kind of work they do. We can distribute it on that form. So by the means of a term application, now you should be clear that application is nothing but a computer program that can help us in some way, and it can run on your machine or some other machine called as a server. Now that application term is understandable, let's go to the other term, Interface. So we will talk about programming, the term in the API, and we will talk about interface first, and then we will talk about the programming. Interface. So this is a quick Bing search about the interface. Interface is a noun as a defined as a point where two system subjects or organization meet and interact, and as a verb is interact with, right? So this is a just common meaning of the word interface. Let's not talk about from the computing perspective right away. So let's talk about the interface. So what is the common example that you can think of this verb, right? So this is the common example that I can think of. This is electric switches that you may know, and it may have different purposes to turn on some tube light, to turn on some heavy application like room heater, or it's just night lamp that you are interested in. So, but you interact with this and it performs the functionality. You don't need to understand how it closes the circuit, and even this all these three but switches can do the exactly same things, and they have a different kind of an interface that you use to interact with. So interface is something that you interact with, is an abstraction of a functionality, and it can be in different form and to perform a same or different action. It can also be switched to some particular electric socket. You don't know that. So we talked about interface from a non-computing aspect. Let's try to see a definition from the computing aspect. In from the Wikipedia, it says that in computing, an interface is a shared boundary across which two or more separate components of a computer system exchange information. Just in your mind, keep an highlight of this word exchange information. So in computing, interface is nothing but exchanging an information, right? So let's go and talk about application consumption and software interface before we talked about an programming aspects in the API. So we talked about what application is. We saw the meaning of a word interface from non-computing aspect. Now we will talk about this application consumption and software interface together, and then we will talk about on programming. So s- software interface, right? So software interface, how would you define a software interface? Any ideas? No. So generally, any application we have divided in multiple forms depending upon this some criteria. But application can also be divided using the criteria how they are being used, like graphical user interface or command line interface. Most of the application being developed or are developed are in the category of graphical user interface. I would say more than 99% of applications are created in the fashion of a graphical user interface, and only handful of an applications are created in command line interface. Graphical user interface is an interface where user is presented with the text box button where he interact with and provide the information which get exchanged with another program. So exactly same thing that we said earlier. Interface, something which we use in computer to exchange the information, and here we use a graphical form to exchange that information. We use a text box, different kind of the input type, radio button, checkbox, drop down, and button to submit some information, and we load the pages to get that information using these interfaces. There are only handful of applications developed uh, in fashion of a command line interface. Command line interface generally are developed for people who are very versed, who are into programming, like a developer and QA. But sometimes normal users who are not intended to use can also use that. The common example of a GUI is you can refer is like a Google search where you use your search query, you add it in text box and you click hit on the search button. That's an example of a GUI or graphical user interface. Command line interface is something is very simple example of a command line application is curl, where you go to the curl, you use particular API URL and you hit it and you get a response for that from that API. right? So where I have used a command line application. Of course, apart from that, there is also category of some application which supports both the graphical user interface and command line interface. Git client is comes to my mind when I think about this command line application. So, so let's go to the next slide. So we talked about an application and we talked about interface. Now let's think about what programming is and programmable means, right? Programmable is nothing but ability in, to consume in a program. So whatever is available, are we able to consume it in a program? Is it that is what programmable is, right? So when we say the API, it's nothing but the interface which is allowed to us in consumed in a programmable fashion, right? I took an example of this particular curl command where I interacted with this particular API which has provided me some details. Of course I use curl command, but that is very easy for me to use the same thing in any computer language and any program. I can use and access this particular API to get this data, and how to use data is totally upon me. So there is this API is having giving me an ability to use or consume this API in a programmatic fashion. That is what programming means. That is what API stands for. Application Programming Interface. The ability to interact with other interfaces in a programming or programmable fashion. Okay, so this API can consumed over a browser or even a REST API client. And I said earlier, API is not always has to be about the REST API or web API. So we will talk about desktop API is short, but let me tell you an example how API are scalable and integration happens and programming aspect is easy for them. So this is one example where I have hit the same API, and you can see I get some data here in a browser, and similar fashion this is in Chrome, and I could use go ahead and use even in same thing in Firefox as well, Chrome and Firefox. So interface gives me ability to fetch the information and use it the way I want, right? That is what the flexibility interface gives us. So we talked about what programmable means and what programming is from the concept of interface. So whenever you think about, so I gave you in general purpose example that you can relate to. We talked about application and how we can relate to the application and how we can categorize them. We talked about interface in non-computing way where we took an example of an electric switches. And when you look at this API as in from the computing perspective, you should imagine this image where we have an electric socket which we can connect with uh, any connectors and use the application right away. A real world example. Electrical supply in your our house or apartment. If you want to use any appliance in our house, we simply plug it into the plug socket and it works. We don't have to wire it directly into the power supply. How inefficient it would have been if we would have to wire it directly, right? It would have been dangerous attempt if we are not an electrician. And every time we have to move from one room to another room, we have to unwire it, right? And then we have to make sure that particular application would get wired at the particular place. But this now gives me an ability to use my charge my laptop, turn on my AC, charge my mobile. I can do that all using this in using this in socket, electric socket, plug socket gives me an ability to do that. So whenever you want to use as an example, this is the best example that you can use for an API. I talked about API to API, so and how it generally get used. So we will see why we need an API. So API, as definition prompted, is used to exchange the information. Of course, there are a lot of applications around the world, but there would be always a need to exchange the information between multiple applications, right? And that is where API comes into the picture. And that is also true for any kind of a development. If you are developing something in a Java and you want to use a date, you don't write everything from a scratch. You use an API provided by the SDK, Software Development Kit, where you import one package related to the local dates and you just start using that package and build on top of that. That is how API helps you. Another very common example of an using an API is a browser extension. Let me show you an example of a browser. So these are the slides that I am showing, and you can see there are different browser applications, browser extensions are there, and I am able to extend the behavior of a browser the way I want. I can add it to the Notion, I can add it to the my notebook, or I can even try to turn this dark mode on for this particular application without any change. If I do that and I refresh it, or if I just go to the Wikipedia page or WikiHow, you would be able to see it. By default, my browser doesn't support dark mode, but it is very easy for me to enable it because of this dark mode extension, that dark reader extensions that I have. And this ability to extend the behavior of an application is possible because browser has given that API to extend it using a fashion. And every time some API is provided, it comes with some documentation and some standard about how to use it. Same like an socket, right? You know the size of the pins that you're gonna plug in. They have a standard. Similarly, like that, if you some APIs exports, there would be some documentation or standard is provided about how to use it, right? So we talked about why we need an API example, where we talked about an extensibility and how browser extension work, and we talked about exchange of an information, where information is exchanged between multiple application. We saw the example of an making call to one API in Chrome and in Firefox and exchanging that information, and we can decide how to use that information if we are doing that in a programmatic fashion. And we also talked about uh, as a building block, as a programmatic building block while we building a big application, where we took an example of an local date. Right. So I can give another example. So API already don't always have to be like a web base, which I mentioned earlier. Here in example that I have wrote earlier, where I am using a VB script and I am trying to just prompt a message box, prompt a message box, and what I'm expecting that I would get an hello world message box after running this particular code. So you can see this particular window has started and I am able to see this hello world here. I have not wrote anything to display this OK button or this cancel button, or even to draw this window. How this is possible just with one line of an code? Because this API is natively provided by the Windows. COM32 or Component Object Model is provided by the Windows operating system, and I'll able to use it without any fuss. I just have to write some VB script and that's it. And it is not it, right? If you see and browse, there are a lot of APIs provided by the Windows, and I can use those APIs and extend the behavior and do some programmatic action the way I want. So that is the use of the API, and these are the real-time examples of an API. So we talked about why we need API. Then last term, API as an umbrella term. So as I mentioned in the start of the video, most of the time API as it's a very broad term, and generally it's used from the context of a web development, where API often refers to the way in which we retrieve the information from an online service. The API documentation will give you list of URLs, query parameters, and other information, how to make a request from API, and inform you sort of a response will be given in each query. So why don't we try to find out an example where we can see some reference documentation. So this is what let's try to find out for the same URL that we have used in the curl. I'll try to open the browser here, and you can see this is the reference documentation that I have provided here, which I can use here. Okay, and All those details would be available here, and you can see, okay, after using those API, what should I use and how should I use it. All those things are available here. If I go to the docs, you can see that all the header, status code, what I should expect, what I should request make, what kind of a data I get, it is available with us, right? So from the web context, or from the web development perspective, a documentation will be given to you with a list of URLs, query parameters, and other information about how to make a request query and what information you can expect from the response. Rest is like a set of a standard which is like very famous. It's a kind of a standards or guideline about how to build the web API. But web API is not always gonna be in REST. REST is a client server architecture which uses HTTP as a stateless protocol for communication, and most of the time or always it uses a JSON as a way to transfer the data between client and server. But apart from REST, there are other protocol as well, like RPC protocol, remote procedure call, where you use an XML or JSON. So you can categorize in a JSON RPC or XML RPC, as an depending upon the binding language, binding data type that you are using, and you can make those call to the remotely running procedure on server machine to get some data, right? Just like RPC and REST, there are another protocol as a SOAP which just does not work on HTTP but also support protocol like SMTP, TCP, and more. SOAP is like an established API protocol which supports XML as a way of transferring the data from server to client. And there are other protocol as well, like in GraphQL, and you have to learn about that. But whenever you come as a term as an API, you need to think about three things that we talked about. We talked about application, we talked about interface, where we saw the plain example of an electric switch, and then we saw an example of an electric plug socket where we can extend the behavior. We saw an example of a browser, we saw an example of a Windows based VB script, and then we talked about a programmable aspect where we can consume interface and use it the way we want to extend the behavior. Right, so that is what should come to your mind when you use an API as a term. You should use think about an exchange of an information from the program running on your machine or another machine. So that is what the API is. I hope everything is clear, at least from the API perspective. We will dig down on the REST API in coming videos, but this should give you some enough idea about what API is. If you are not sure or if you have any question, please add it in the comment. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel. Thank you.